Hello. So I think most of you know me by now, but if you don't, I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And as we're closed for the pandemic, I'm trying my best to keep me from going stir crazy. And so you guys get to sit through me talking about genealogy. So I hope it's a win all around. I had fun putting this one together. I mean, I enjoy most of them, but this one was more fun than usual. I'm going to talk about tracing our female ancestors. Now, to a great extent, a lot of what you do to trace women is the same as what you do to trace men. There's just a couple extra layers of complication in terms of how things were done that can make life interesting. So let me share my screen. And do you guys have the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
We'll start with the slideshow from beginning. So this is a picture of my great aunt, and then my great-great-grandmother, and then her mother and her mother. And it shows one of the problems that we have when we're tracing women. We have Louisa Paige Weston. Actually, let me start the other way. We have Helen Leroyd Roberts is the younger girl on the right. And then Jessie Sears Leroyd is her mother. And her mother is, let's see, Caroline Weston Sears. And then her mother is, takes me a minute here, I should know this by heart, but they're not in age order. And then this is Louisa Paige Weston. So, you know, I have to work at not grimacing every time I look at this picture, because my second cousin twice removed, who inherited a lot of this, used Scotch tape on the photographs. And it just, my librarian heart just breaks every time I see it. She also wrote right on, or somebody wrote right on the picture. So that's, but this picture is now being cared for nicely at the Danvers, Massachusetts Archival Center. But what this shows is how last names change in every generation for these women, which makes it harder to trace them, because so much of what we do is surname based. You know, when you look somebody up in an index, you look by their surname. So that's one of the difficulties we have, is that in many cultures, especially for those who settled in New England, women change their name on marriage. And so if you don't have a marriage record, it can be very hard to find her maiden name, and therefore hard to find the rest of her family. Now, it was not, changing names is not universal. This is a sample from 1861 in Scotland, where you have William Little married to Margaret Gregg, or Gregg. I've heard it pronounced both ways. And Margaret Gregg's mother is Margaret Cant. And those are both their maiden names. This is not a case where the mother remarried. She retained her maiden name. That was true in parts of Italy. I've read and seen some evidence that it was true in parts of Quebec, at least in legal records. So Scottish records are really nice, because like baptismal records, unlike in England, where they don't even list the mother's first name in a lot of cases, you would see a record that says William Little and Margaret Gregg, his spouse, had a daughter. baptized on such and such a date. England did finally, about 5 years ago, start putting a mother's name, a bride's and groom's mother's name on its marriage records. It took until something like 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm really happy my dad's side of the family was in Scotland, where the records have had the mother's maiden name practically from the beginning. So this is just so you know that sometimes the names don't change, and don't be surprised with certain cultures if you do find maiden names. Just be really happy. But here's the other thing that happens. Here's an interesting one. This is a newspaper article from the 1870s, if I remember correctly, on noting the celebration of the 60th anniversary of a marriage occurred at Topsfield on Saturday. The couple being Zacchaeus Gould and wife, and the guests including a granddaughter. Blah, blah, blah. Mr. Gould is the father of 10 children, 6 of whom are still living, and his family's been remarkably healthy one. What's missing here? Anybody?
Her name is.
Yeah, nothing about, I mean, he's the father of 10 children. Who's the mother? You know, Zacchaeus Gould and wife are the guests of honor at this 60th anniversary party. There's also a brother of Mr. Gould and wife. So it's 2 different Goulds with their wives, neither of whom are mentioned. So this is the problem you run into is, you know, fortunately I have her name from other sources. Doesn't do me much good because it was Abigail Brown and there's nothing about her father on the marriage record, and I'm still stuck on her. But this is the type of record you get that can be very frustrating. Sometimes you get one like this. Mrs. Jack Stallcup died Tuesday night at her home. That's really informative, isn't it? Here's what's happening. In English law, essentially for a good chunk of the last 400 years or so, women were regarded as part of their husband, basically, legally. You know, when a woman got married, she legally did not have a separate existence from her husband in countries that based their law on English common law. Now, again, this is not the case in Quebec, Louisiana, the parts of the US that were Spanish colonies. When they were Spanish colonies, the law was not this way. You know, the countries that tended to follow more of a continental civil law didn't do this, but English civil common law did. It treated a wife as part of the same unit as her husband and not separate from him, which means that there were large time periods where women couldn't own property if they were married, or their husband essentially controlled the property if she owned it, and things like that, which is why she's often not in records. Now, there are times this works for our advantage, and I'll talk about some of those at some point. So, records to look at. These are typical records, but one of the things you want to do for a woman is to make sure that you're not looking at only her records. You want to take a look at the records for her children as well. In the census, is her mother living with them when her mother's in her 80s? If you have a marriage record and the woman has a common name, who are the witnesses? Was she young enough that somebody, her father or someone, had to give permission for her to marry? And is that recorded? Death certificates and cemetery records. Again, sorry, let me back up. And with marriage records, if you're struggling on a maiden name, maybe you don't have a marriage record for her. Let's say she got married in 1830 in Maine. What if a couple of her children got married in Massachusetts in the 1870s? That would list her maiden name. And so that's one reason you want to look at all the children, not just the one you're descended from, because different records got different, generated in different places and in different ways. Same thing with death certificates. If you can't find her maiden name, you want to check all of her kids' death records, because maybe one of them has it. Cemetery records, where's she buried? Did they bury her in her family plot if she died young and her husband's family didn't have a plot nearby? Church records, especially her children being baptized. Who are the witnesses? If those are listed, often one of the witnesses is from her side of the family. And that can, again, help you tease out who her family might be. Does that make sense to everybody? And I get very frustrated when people, they transcribe and index records and they don't do the witnesses. You have to go look for it, because the witnesses are never indexed, in my experience. The other thing you want to think about is thinking about all the identities she's had. We've talked a fair bit about how flexible names were, but could she be in a record by a nickname? If you're descended from the first husband and she had two more, have you looked carefully for all the records from when she was married to the second two men? Because the answer may be big. It's easy to say, oh, she had no children with her third husband, so I'm not going to bother to look any further. But what if there are deeds where she and her third husband are settling a brother's estate? Something like that. I've come across cases where women, particularly if their stepfather was more socially prominent or well off than their deceased father had been, that they informally take the stepfather's name. There was no process to legally change it in most cases, but particularly if there were only one or two kids from the first marriage, it may have been easier to just have all the kids use the same last name. Titles. You will find women listed as Widow Smith, Widow Putnam, Widow Gould, Widow Littlefield. And those don't, the genealogy search engines are, like at Ancestry, are pretty good about nicknames. They're not as good about picking out cases where the woman is listed as widow and a surname. And so I have more than once found somebody by searching for widow in the first name column, or first name box. Women also sometimes went by their initials, the same way men did, either intentionally or because the census taker was lazy and only wrote an initial for everybody. Sometimes, especially with deeds, in the indexes, you will see the words et ux or et al, and they stand for and wife and others. And this can be especially helpful in two cases. One is if a man sold property, in many cases, the wife had to sign off on her dower right. When a man died in English common law, the wife was owed usually a third of the estate as a life interest or until she remarried. And so if he sold that land while he was still alive, she had to agree to giving up her right to it. And you will find that listed in deeds in some cases. The same thing, the other case I've seen is when a couple is buying land from her family, from a brother or a cousin or her father. That deed may list at ox and wife in a way that the man's other deeds don't. And that's often the case also if you see a sale for some very low amount of money, like a dollar when the property was valued at $500. Take a look and see who the husband is buying from. Because yes, it may be his side of the family, but it may be her side as well. Another thing to keep track of with French Canadians, with Portuguese in Massachusetts, Italian in Massachusetts, anyone who came from a non-English speaking country, people played around with their names. Sometimes they anglicize one part early on and then 10 years later anglicize their first name. They may appear in hybrid records. I've seen cases in records, especially of people who are Eastern European Jews from Poland and Lithuania and places, on records anglicizing their parents' names when their parents never came to the US and stayed in Lithuania. But, you know, Rivka Wojcik became Rebecca White so they anglicized the mother's name. So that's something to be aware of as well. Men tend to be very flexible with their names, but women tended to be even more flexible because of changing name at marriage or having things like the title after the husband died. This is an interesting one I found. Blogger I like did a search for Sarah Furman and maiden name and found this record, an obituary listing her maiden name and both husbands' names. And the fact that when she died, she had 260 descendants living. So sometimes something really basic like Googling a woman's married name with maiden name could get you somewhere. It won't often, but sometimes it will. So, as I said, other records to look at, deeds, including waiving dower rights, probate. It's an interesting issue because this is one of the times where, I talk fairly frequently about the fact that you should start with what you know and work backwards. This is one of the times where sometimes you actually want to guess at who her father might be. If you have a maiden name and you know she was probably from the area, sometimes you will want to then go and look at the probate of all those men with that last name for that county to see if you can find her listed in the probate. Because like with the witnesses in christenings, probate only indexes generally the person whose estate it is. It does not list in the index all of the heirs. And so you can find women sometimes listed by their married names in their father's estate. Newspapers, you've all heard me on, the topic of newspapers. One thing I want to mention here, in addition to the regular newspaper stuff, is that there were, particularly from the time of the Civil War until about World War II, there were a lot of newspapers that were religious and or ethnic in another language in this country. There were newspapers in French and German and Swedish. And those papers often have details that weren't in the English papers if one of your ancestors belonged to one of those groups. I'm sure we've all heard jokes about military bureaucracy. But one of the early examples of military bureaucracy in this country is pensions. And pensions were one of the places where you may well find an example of, you may find the woman's maiden name. I'm going to show you a couple examples in a minute. But a widow had to prove that she was due the money. You've also heard me talk about, money generates records. People cared about money and property. That's going to generate records. And so that's where you get the deeds and the probate and the military pensions, where they're going to be more clear because it deals with money. Up to 1922, very few women were naturalized on their own. They became, if they were a foreign citizen, they became a US citizen when their husband naturalized. So you often have to look at his naturalization record in order to find information about her, and it may well have information about her, whether it's her maiden name, a birth date, a town of birth, something that can help you narrow down who she was. So let's take a look a little more carefully at pension records. So this is one that's online at Fold 3, but there's an index at Family Search, and you'll notice that when they indexed these, they actually, if the woman's maiden name was in the file, they put it in the index. So this is really interesting. This is good because it tells you what her, and then it gives her husband's name here. And you'll notice this says Civil War widows and other dependents. Look at that date range, 1861 to 1934. That's quite a long span of time. Now, some of these don't happen to be, as far as I can tell, but some of them will be children of the soldier. But even in those, you may have a case where they've had to prove that their parents were married at the time the child was born and or at the time the Civil War happened. And the rules varied on getting a pension and whether the couple had to be married at the time of his service or not. That's a whole separate talk, but it's a really good source of maiden names for women who were married in the 19th century to men who were of the right age to serve in the Civil War, because they had to prove that they were married. And here's one. This was from West Virginia, and she says that her name at this point is Susanna Riffey. She's a resident of Webster in the county of Taylor in West Virginia, aged 89. So she's born in 1804 or so. She's the widow of George Riffey. Her maiden name was Susanna B. Smith, and she was married to the said George Riffey on or about the 11th day of April, 1852, at Turkey River in the county of Taylor and state of Virginia, now West Virginia. The name of the minister, and that the marriage was recorded in book number 1, Record of Marriages, page probably 301 there, in Taylor County, Virginia. How's that for telling you where to go look for the record? Now, that record may no longer exist. That may be a county courthouse that burned. The book may have gotten wet, but at least it gives you a time and place to start looking. So you can see how that would be very handy, wouldn't you? But she had to prove that she was married to him in order to get the money. And it was not generous money, but it was better than nothing. So if you want to go further, and I'm going to talk more about a lot of these on Thursday, it's still true you need to get to know the men in her family. You know, there's a good chance that the men in her husband's family interacted with the men in her birth family before she was married. Looking, and again, I'm going to talk more about this on Thursday. County histories written in the 1800s often have comments about who someone's father-in-law was. In fact, I've seen that almost as often as I've seen a woman's maiden name. I've seen several cases like that Gould celebration note that where they don't they'll say so-and-so married a daughter of this man. Thomas Smith married the daughter of Michael Roberts. And they don't tell you what her name is, but at least it gives you a place to look to see what her name might have been. Women also, because through most of the 19th century and earlier, there wasn't much legal presence for women, you are going to find them in less formal papers. And this is where the local historical society collections come in. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And obituaries can help. Yes, I've shown you one that was completely unhelpful, but sometimes they are. And children's names. So let's look. I've had really good success sometimes with diaries that are in places that you wouldn't expect that they'd survived. This is another one from the Danvers Archival Center. It's really not a full diary. It's more of a day book where they write a sentence or two every day. Rather, and it's very practical. It's about the weather or who they saw. But this kind of record may say, saw my sister. Or, if it's the husband's book, it may say, wife's sister so-and-so came to visit. And that can give you a name to start looking at records of the sister, because she may have generated records that your ancestor didn't. There's another one of these that's, those of you who followed my Weston saga with the ad about asking the neighbors if you want to know more about my wife, why my wife left me. That man's mother and stepfather kept one of these day books that has some details that are available nowhere else. But they were written in the 18 teens and 20s, so they're contemporary with the events. Letters, same thing. They're going to be less formal records, but they'll be contemporary with the events. This is a letter from Polly, from Julia Horton to her future sister-in-law 8 years before she got married. So they obviously knew each other before Julia married Polly's brother. And these are going to show up not at Ancestry for the most part, not even at Family Search. They're going to be in little historical societies for the most part, many of which do not have an online catalog. And I'll talk a bit more about how I found some of them on Thursday when I go into some of the actual process of this. And here's a couple obituaries. The one on the right, very nicely tells you who her father was. This one on the left, if you read through, there are sisters and 2 brothers mentioned. So you can probably guess from this that Mrs. Kenny's maiden name was likely Brooks, because it has 2 brothers with that name. And so I would work on that assumption that her maiden name was Brooks and go see if I can find a woman who fits. And then work on confirming that. One of the other interesting bits that happened in late colonial and 19th century New England was the use of middle names. And this happened in Scotland somewhat as well, but it was very common in New England from about 1785 until almost 1900. So here's an example. You've all heard of Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women and Little Men. Her father was Amos Bronson Alcott, and her mother was Abby May, married name Alcott. So you'll notice there are 4 girls: Anna Bronson, Louisa May, Elizabeth Sewell, and Abigail May. Well, 2 of the 4 girls have May as a middle name, which was their mother's maiden name. Anna shares a middle name with her father, which was also his mother's maiden name. So paternal grandmother's maiden name. And then Elizabeth Sewell Alcott had her mother's maiden name. And I had been able to use this several times, that time period from 1790 to 1840, that's almost a black hole of Northern New England genealogy. I've been able to use this a couple times to get an idea of what families within a community we should be looking at to see who the wife may be. And then this is interesting. So Bronson Alcott's father was Joseph Chatfield Alcott, and his mother's name was Chatfield. So that gives you a bit of how to think about middle names in the first half of the 19th century are at least as likely to be a family maiden name as they are to be a second first name, second given name. So that's the end of the PowerPoint for today. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and talk a little more. So basically, the trick to finding female ancestors is persistence. It's being willing to look past the first reading of a record. So, yes, you've looked at the record and you've got the baptismal record for the child, you've got the date of birth, the date of baptism. Well, you want to go and look also at who the witnesses were, if they're listed, and figure out how, are they just people pulled up random from the congregation, or are they family members? Being willing to say, hey, like in the case of the Alcotts, well, maybe you didn't recognize that May was a family name, but if you looked at those 4 sisters and went, Sewell, that's a good old New England name. I wonder if somebody in her family has that as a maiden name. And let's take a look at the people around the family to see if we find any Sewells. Does that make sense to everybody? A lot of this is, when all of us start out with genealogy to a great extent, the first 2 or 3 generations in a lot of cases, I don't want to say they're easy, but the records are in formats that we understand. They're still the formats that we use. And what happens is you hit some point in the 19th century where the records we use don't exist. And the legal system for women was such that the records that did tend to exist, that did tend to be indexed, that tend to be digitized, are not the records that women are going to be in. They're military records, they're deeds. And so it's looking for things that are a little off the beaten path as a way of figuring out who a woman might have been before she got married. Yeah. She did not plop down from a spaceship. I mean, I've got one that I'm convinced she did, because I have spent 22 years looking for this woman. Actually, 23 years looking for this woman now. You need to update that. I started looking for her in 1997. And I am no further now than I was in 1997. Well, that's not quite true. I've crossed off a whole lot of possibilities. So that's something that you need, but so a lot of it is persistence and not getting frustrated when you don't find a marriage certificate right away. It's figuring out, where could another record be that has that. Anyone have questions? Come on, people, somebody's got to have a question. Okay.
I've got one.
Okay.
It's the middle initial that you cannot find the name for. Any thoughts? I just don't find it. I didn't find it on military records. It wasn't in the newspaper when he died.
Yeah, middle initials are interesting because there were points where the Congregational Church, which was the dominant church in New England, evidently was not including them in the baptismal records, which were then and a lot of people didn't have a middle name because it wasn't given when they were born, but 30 years later, when it had become the style, they chose one. I have a couple of those too that I finally figured one of them out. But I've got a couple that I still haven't, and that's the only, in every record, it's the person with their middle initial, and there's nothing that I can find. I would urge not making assumptions about that. Even if it's the same initial as starts his mother's maiden name, I would not assume that that is what it is.
Yeah, I have a feeling that it's Oscar Franklin, but I can't find anything. But his brothers were Alexander Monroe, Winslow Wright, and Joshua Morrill. So it tends to be a last name, but probably it's not in the family.
Yeah.
It's more like it's taken from political figures.
Yeah. I have a several greats uncle who was Horace Greeley. Now I've forgotten which one. It's been a long day. Gould. His mother was it turns out his mother was actually a niece of Horace Greeley. And so it was actually a family name. So
I've got 3 or 4 different George Washingtons.
yeah, and
Something.
the one that surprises people is Lorenzo Dow was a famous minister. And so if you find a Lorenzo in the first half of the 19th century in New England, that's why. And his middle name is almost certainly Dow,
I'll
named for
check it
Lorenzo
out.
Dow.
I've got 3 or 4 Lorenzos in that period.
Yep, and that's where that name comes from, is they were naming the kids after this famous, he was the equivalent of Billy Graham at the time.
Yeah.
And so people were naming their kids after him. Okay, so let me look at the written questions. Thursday, part 2 is at 10 a.m. I'm going to talk about some of these things in more detail. And I'm also going to say, if any of you have interesting stories, bring them. If you found something in a quirky way, bring your story and you can share it. Okay? Because that's one of the things is you'll find is that cat hair. I brushed him earlier today too. You will find that there are more quirks to finding, because they're more obscure records in some cases, there are more quirks to finding the records. Does that make sense? Would the wife be explicitly mentioned in the petition for naturalization records? From about 1890 until 1922, frequently. I don't want to say always, but quite often. And they'll list all the children and when and where they were born. I'll try to pull up one of those for on Thursday so you can see. It was a pre-printed form they were filling out. Okay, use of Mrs. for single women. This is an interesting thing. In colonial New England, you had a fair bit of social hierarchy. And men who were socially prominent were called Mr. And those who were lower down the social scale were called Goodman. Did anyone else read Young Goodman Brown in high school English? Okay. Oh, well. And so if a woman was the wife or a daughter of a man who was called Mr., she got called Mrs., whether she was the wife or the daughter. And the wife of a man called Goodman was called good wife or goody. And this ended by about 1800, 1810. After that, you can be reasonably sure it's a Mrs. is a married woman. But up until that point, it's a social status. And I think a lot of it is when the US became a separate country, it was sort of rebelled against that class distinction in titles. But that's why you will see, you don't see Goodman or Goodwife in writing that often, but you will see the Mrs. in records. And I've had to more than once convince somebody that their several greats grandmother who got married at 20 as Mrs. Ann Smith was not a widow, but just the daughter of somebody prominent. It's basically, I don't want to make it sound like it's some amazingly difficult or separate thing. It's still just straight genealogy but recognizing the legal climate that encouraged women to be more documented in informal sources, like the letters and diaries, than in legal sources or in military records. I mean, women are half your ancestors, so it's not like it's some little minority group, right? So, you know, it's the same. So that's it. But basically, on Thursday, I'll do a bit more with some examples and a couple cases where I've found things that have helped me figure things out, or that haven't helped me figure things out. So you can see where some of the challenges come. And as I said, if any of you have any really good stories that you want to share, feel free to have a couple minute summary and we'll have a chance for those as well. Okay? So, yeah, the straight maternal line using DNA, mitochondrial DNA just doesn't change that much, and it's still an expensive test and relatively few people have done it. I haven't done it yet, which tells you that it's still not common. I have the interesting situation. My mother's family's in New England, so I actually have my straight maternal line back to about 1600, whereas my dad's straight paternal line goes back to Ireland, and it stops at 1820-ish. And so I'm in the slightly unusual position that I have my straight maternal line back a whole lot further than my straight paternal line, but it's strictly a quirk of the geography. So yeah, and on Thursday, I will also have the sheet of some resources for you. I'm still working on that. Yeah, adoption in DNA is always an interesting challenge. Yeah, one of the things that Ancestry still struggles with, looking at the last comment here, is dealing with sorting records for women from maiden names from married names. And so that's one where you have to do both and try to figure it out. It's one of those things I don't think computers are going to get it fair. You know, it's easy enough to program the different spellings of Catherine and Kathy and Katie and all of that, but when you start getting women's names changing in the middle of their life, that's something really hard for computers to figure out. And that's why, you know, on some of my tough cases, I actually have a spreadsheet where I have the major places I'm going to search across the top and the various names a woman used at different points in her life. You know, maiden name with her nickname is the first name, first husband's name, second husband's name, and so on. And I go through and still manually do it, and I check it off when I do it. And that is sometimes what you need to do, because it's just not, at this point, you don't want to trust the computer to do that for you, to link the maiden and married names. The computer just doesn't have the brains. It is still, our brains still have some flexibility that computers don't. So, yeah, Sadie was usually Sarah, as was Sally. I don't know if it was a nickname for anything else. You know, the thing is, on all of these nicknames, you get people who have a nickname that has no relation to any other part of their name. I know someone whose name was Thelma, and I've forgotten her middle name, but she hated the name Thelma, so she went by Iris from the time she was 13, but never changed it legally. So in letters and diaries and things like that, and in the census, she's Iris, but on her marriage record, she's Thelma. Yeah, why she chose Iris, I have no idea. But she liked it better than Thelma, which I guess I can understand. So that's one of those things that it's hard to know. And I can talk about sort of standard nicknames, but there's always that couple, 2, 3, 4% that there's no clue where it came from. Does that make sense? Yeah, Nancy was common, and by the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was a separate name. It had early on been a nickname for Anne, but by about 1800, it was a name in its own right. And in fact, the woman I was talking about, who's the 23-year search, she's a Nancy, born about 1790, married 1810 in Salem, Massachusetts. So it was actually a quite common name in the early 1800s. So, okay, well, I hope you learned something. That's always my goal. I like that about the great-grandfather's 3 wives all had the same initials. Yeah, I have somebody, he married 3 different women, all named Elizabeth, which is not that uncommon a name, so I'm sure he was not doing it deliberately, but he married 3 women named Elizabeth. But try figuring out which kid goes with which if you don't have the marriage records to know when the wife changed. So at least when it's a wife marrying 2 different men named William, the kids' names change. So, well, thanks for showing up, and hope to see some of you Thursday. And I will post this. Let me put this here again. This is the blog where I'm posting the recordings. So if you missed part of this, if you've missed one, whatever, if you want to refer a friend, they're all posted there. And now I will stop the recording.